Hi, everybody. I just want to talk to you a little bit about this information you're getting in the Nearpod about the eve of the Civil War. So, one big issue is the sectionalism that developed between the North and the South in the country. The North and the South continued to grow further and further apart in their economy, in their people, and their cultures. As you saw, the North developed into a manufacturing industry, and they had more and more states that outlawed slavery. And while the South became more and more dependent on slaves because of their reliance on cotton, the cotton gin had made cotton so much more profitable that they began growing huge amounts of cotton, but they needed the slave labor in order to make that happen. And so this issue, um, the differences between the North and the South just became bigger and bigger, especially the issue of slavery. So the next thing I want to just talk about a little bit is the Dred Scott case. So Dred Scott was a slave whose owner took him into first Illinois and then Wisconsin. In both of those states, slavery was illegal. So Dred Scott thought that he should be freed because he now lived in those states. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's decision decided two major things that had significant impacts on the country. One, Chief Justice Taney wrote in his decision that African Americans were so inferior that they could never be U.S. citizens, and that white Americans did not owe them any rights. And then the second thing that the Supreme Court said is that the Congress did not even have authority to prohibit slavery in new territories coming into the United States. And as we learned with the compromises activity that you did last week, trying to keep a balance between free and slave states in the Congress was how we kept the country kind of together for a long time, dealing with the slavery issue. So this pronouncement that Congress didn't have that right to say if territories could not have slavery, and made Northerners very nervous. And it also made Northerners nervous because of his statement on African Americans. He's basically saying that they couldn't ever be citizens, and they were afraid, a lot of Northern abolitionists were afraid he was opening up slavery to just be in the entire United States. Um, so it did increase tensions among the North and South a lot. Uh, then about the same time, we had Bleeding Kansas, which one of those compromises that you learned about before was the Missouri Compromise, where they set a certain latitude line that would be anything above this would be free, anything below this would be South, and we'd bring states in together, and that would keep the balance in Congress. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned that, and it was stated that both Kansas and Nebraska would decide if they would be free or slave states based on popular sovereignty, which was the idea that each territory, the people in the territory, would decide. So thousands of pro-slavery and abolitionists flooded into Kansas to help try to make that decision for Kansas. And violence erupted between the two sides. You learn on this slide a little bit about John Brown, who was a very ardent abolitionist and turned to violence to try to get rid of slavery. So we have violence already being happening in the country about the slavery issue. And then we get to the election of 1860. The election of 1860 is one of the most important presidential elections of our history. There were four different candidates, as you can see from this graphic. The Democrats split. They had two candidates. The Northern Democrats chose Stephen Douglas. The Southern Democrats chose John Breckinridge, because Stephen Douglas opposed federal slaves codes in territories, and he supported popular sovereignty. He wanted each state, each territory to be able to choose for themselves. whereas John Breckinridge was just a pro-slavery candidate, and he did want federal slave codes to be enforced in all states. And then you had Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican, and he was not advocating for the complete abolition of slavery. His position was that there should be no more slavery in new territories. And then there was John Bell, who represented a new party, which was the Constitutional Union Party. And their whole issue was we need to keep the Union together, we need to support the Constitution, and so we're just going to avoid the slavery issue. Um, and so this, because there were 4 different candidates, it split the vote in interesting ways. So because there were 2 Democratic candidates, that split up the Democratic vote, and Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, ended up winning, even though you can see from the graphic on the screen that this was a very partisan decision, that nobody voted for Abraham Lincoln in the South. In many of the states, I should say no state voted for Abraham Lincoln in the South. And in many of the southern states, he wasn't even on the ballot. And yet, he actually did win the popular vote, and he ended up winning the electoral college vote. This led the southern states to become very frightened that they were going to lose the right to slavery. And so Abraham Lincoln was elected November 6th of 1860, and by December 20th of 1860, South Carolina had seceded from the nation. And then southern states just kept falling in line after South Carolina did that. And this is what is the beginning of the Civil War, where the North and the South fought over the questions of should we keep the Union together, and of course that issue of slavery. Should we abolish slavery? Should states be allowed to have slavery? And we finally answered that question through much bloodshed in our country through the Civil War.